So can I ask a question?
Please.
Sir, about the numbers being interesting, the reason why this is a paradox or a self-referencing paradox is because the word interesting is a human construction. The numbers are indifferent to the description of them being called interesting.
Absolutely. So that's the solution to the paradox. That is the solution to the paradox. In other words, the word interesting can't be formalized. It can't be exact. Okay. Here's another thing. Here's another thing that's the same type of idea. Okay. 0 is a small number. Okay. 1 is a small number. 2 is a small number. Okay. Now let's say I have a number 58,672. Okay. And I say, you know what? That's a small number too. Well, if I add one more to it, 58,633, okay, that's still a small number. In other words, if x is a small number, then x plus 1 is a small number. Now, if you follow that along, you'll see that every number is a small number. Okay, so that's called the small number paradox. Okay, but that's a silly paradox. And the reason why it's a silly paradox is because the definition of the word small is not a good definition. There's no exact definition of the word small. So let me give you an example. If I say I have $42 in my bank account, or rupees, that's a very small number, and that's not good. Okay, but if I say I have 42 diseases, I went to the doctor and he told me I have 42 different diseases, so that's a very big number, and you're going to die soon. Okay, so that's a very big number. So the question is 42 small or is 42 big? And the answer is there's no exact definition for that, and because there's no exact definition, you can't say whether a number is big or small. So that small number paradox is a little bit silly. So let me just put that. Remember we did last week this separation between the physical world and the mental linguistic world, and we have a subpart of that called math and science. So I'm talking about numbers which seem to belong to that math and science part, which doesn't have contradictions. However, what we're doing is we're applying those numbers, which are exact. The number 42 is exact. 42 minus 1 is 41. We can't argue about that. 42 plus 1 is 43. We can't argue about that. That's very, very exact. But when we apply it to the real world, or when we try to apply it to the real world, like the word interesting or small, those are things that we're trying to make a connection between the real world and numbers. That's where we get into trouble. So you have to keep that separation clear in your mind. Okay, so again, that's why this is interesting, because we're dealing with things that are numbers which are exact, and yet we seem to have paradoxes there too. But you're right. The word interesting can't be formalized. The word beautiful can't be formalized. Okay, so for example, we'll talk about this in chapter 6. I'd like to make a computer that can look at a painting, and tell me if that's artistic or not. Okay, and that can't be done. I can't make such a computer to do that. Why not? Because there's no exact definition of what's beautiful or what's artistic. So we can't do that.
So, with this, I have a remark. We can use a computer in artificial intelligence to make a painting that is beautiful, but the computer won't be able to see it. Actually, it's related to the thing that you said. Something multiplication is easy, prime number factorization is difficult. The factorization is difficult in the sense that the computer doesn't have aesthetic value. It can't search within a search space which of the paintings is aesthetically beautiful. But if you allow it to run a different combination, it can come up with a beautiful painting because it will run through all the possibilities.
I have to disagree with you. I don't think that a computer can make a beautiful painting. And I want to give you just an example. One of the greatest artists of all time, is named Vincent van Gogh, whatever. Okay, in his lifetime, he never sold a painting. Okay, he painted and he sent his paintings to his brother, and his brother was never able to sell. He wasn't able to sell any of his paintings. Okay, and now his paintings go for millions and millions of dollars. Okay, so now I want to ask you a question. Let's say I wanted a computer to paint a beautiful painting. Okay, and I would want I want the computer to come up with a beautiful painting and come up with a nice idea. Who would consider that painting beautiful? In other words, the art historian, the art connoisseurs from Van Gogh's generation or our generation. In other words, we think Van Gogh was the greatest thing, but in his generation and people who lived around him, they didn't think his paintings were worth anything. So how can I get a computer to paint a beautiful painting when it's not clear what the definition of beautiful is? In other words, in his generation, his paintings were available and nobody thought they were beautiful. So it's hard to say that what you said, that a computer can make a beautiful painting. A computer can make a painting that I can program and say, look, I like this, 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 and this. You can do random stuff and make sure it's like this, this, and this, and then I'll say, oh, wow, that's very nice. Okay, and we do that, especially not only with painting, but with music. In other words, we have certain types of music and we get computers to do certain type of rhythms that we call beautiful. But in other cultures, they would hear that music and they would say, that's horrible music. Okay, so different cultures have different tastes. Okay, and even the same culture has different taste over time. In other words, as time progresses, their tastes change. So it's very hard to say that a computer is doing something that's beautiful. What it's doing is it's beautiful for the one who set up the program, okay, or for the culture that he's trying to appeal to. But it's not always true. I love Bollywood films. I absolutely adore Bollywood films. Okay. I wish I could direct a few Bollywood films. To me, that would be heaven on earth. Okay, but a lot of people don't like Bollywood films. And so it's hard. It's hard to. How would you get a computer to make the perfect Bollywood film? Okay, well, you'd add in certain things and you'd say this is a Bollywood film. Oh, this is a Hollywood film. We don't want that. And there are different types of films. Whatever. So aesthetics or beauty is not something that's simply programmable. Just one second. The computers are wonderful, but if the plug goes out, then you're in trouble. So I just had to plug in the plug. So you can have all the artificial intelligence in the world, but you better make sure your computer is plugged in.
Like even if we talk about being programmable, we are unable to program it because we ourselves don't have a proper definition of all of these. Nah? Like even if we talk about the Bollywood movies, every movie is not liked by everyone. So we don't have a common standard among ourselves as a people, as a combined society. That's why we are unable to program it.
Right. So what I think you're saying is that even people who love Bollywood films, they love certain types of Bollywood films and not other types of Bollywood films. Any Bollywood film with Ashwari is perfect. What's her name? The actress, Ashwari. Right. So she doesn't have to act. Whatever. She just on the screen. Whatever. Anyways, right. So I grew up in the same house as my brother, and he likes a certain film, and I like a certain other film, and I don't like his films, and he doesn't like my films, whatever. So it's hard to, even within one culture, within one family, to find what is beautiful and what is not beautiful.
No, sir. My point was not that irrespective of whatever is at a particular moment in time, people are considering what is of aesthetic value. If we just leave the computer and the computer has great computing power, it will do random things and it will come up with a painting. And you were exactly right. I read an article that in artificial intelligence only that they used artificial intelligence to produce music, and they asked Chopin experts to differentiate between the music produced by the artificial intelligence and that of Chopin. And some of them were confused.
I agree, but the type of music that was produced was made to be of a specific type, okay, and it's not necessarily clear that everyone will like that specific type. Aesthetics is not objective, okay. It depends on the person. It depends on the person. It depends on the time. Even more so, there were certain types of movies and there's certain types of music that I liked 10 years ago that now I can't listen to. So the same person. I'm the same person, but 10 years down the road, I just don't like certain things that I loved 10 years ago. And I'm sure there are certain things that I like now that I will not like in 10 years from now. So it's not objective. As opposed to that, the number 7 is a prime number. Whether I like it or not, whether my brother wants to hear that or not, or now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, the number 7 is going to be a prime number. That's an objective thing. And so I can get a computer to print out all the prime numbers. That's with ease. But I cannot get a computer to print out, to make paintings which everyone will like, or I can get a computer to print out things that I like at the moment, paintings that I like at the moment, that maybe yes. But I'm not sure that's a very interesting result, because I'm basically telling the computer to print it, to do certain things, and it's doing that. That's not interesting. Yeah, so it's not simple.
In that nutshell, we are saying that if you have an objective definition of any parameter, then we can program it or use computers to create that.
Right. If you give computers parameters of what you want, it will do it. It will do it randomly. In other words, you give it parameters and say, I want it to print out music on this pace and this thing, of this tone, that tone. Within those parameters, it could probably do it. And there's some beautiful electronic music out there. But it's of a certain style. It's not for everyone.
And so that style is predetermined by humans to be good.
Right. Certain people like classical music, certain people like rock music, and certain people like different types of music.
Yes,
Each one is independent.
Now can we come to the Barber paradox?
So the Barber Paradox is a very cute paradox, and it's based on a story that Bertrand Russell said. And Bertrand Russell was a philosopher, and he was aware of these self-referential problems, and so he made up this story. And the story goes as follows. There's a village that's on top of a mountain, okay, and it has a few people live in this village, okay, and what they have is the village has only one barber, okay. And there are two types of people that live in this village. Those people who cut their own hair, and they don't go to the barber. There's no reason to go to the barber, because they cut their own hair. Or those people who go to the barber, and then they don't cut their hair, they go to the barber. Okay? And so the village has the following rule. If you cut your own hair, you don't go to the barber. And if you don't cut your own hair, then you have to go to the barber. So that's the law in the village. Okay? And the question is as follows. What about the barber? Okay, if the barber cuts his own hair, then he's not allowed to go to the barber. But he is the barber. Okay, and if the barber doesn't cut his own hair, then he has to go to the barber. But then he'll be cutting his own hair. So it's the same type of contradiction. If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true, going back and forth. Okay, so you have this paradox by this one person. For every other person in the village, it works, but for this one person, it doesn't work. Now, let me just explain to you what this is about. What happens in the real world? Okay, in Bombay, there's Mumbai, there's barbers all over. And what happens is, people go to the barber, people don't go to the barber, but sometimes when the store is empty, one barber will give the other barber a haircut. Okay, so that's what happens in the real world. There's more than one barber, and people cut their own hair. Some people go to the barber, some people don't go to the barber. But the barber himself either cuts his own hair or he goes to another barber. Okay, so we don't have that problem. But in this village on top of a mountain, there's only one barber. Okay, so we have this contradiction. This one barber, if he cuts his own hair, he's not allowed to go to the barber, but he is the barber. Okay, and if he goes to the barber, he is the barber. That means he's cutting his own hair, and therefore he's not allowed to go to the barber. Okay, so this is a contradiction, and it's a very cute contradiction. It's a cute story. It's not real, but it's a cute story, and Russell showed it because it's an example of self-reference. Okay, let me explain to you why. Okay, you have a set of villagers. You have a collection of villagers. And those villagers, some of them cut their own hair, and some of them are cut by the barber. But the barber is living in the village. So that's the self-reference. Villagers are getting their hair cut by villagers. That's that self-reference. me say that again. Villagers, people who live in the village, are getting their hair cut by villagers. Okay, and so you want to know, the village, are they cutting their own hair or they're not cutting their own hair? And so you can make that same self-referential paradoxes. Just like English sentences talking about English sentences, you can get into a paradox. So too, if you talk about villagers cutting their own hair, you can get into a paradox. And you do get into a paradox. Now, the solution to this paradox, again, we never like paradoxes. Okay, and this is a paradox that's not happening in language. Nobody's talking in this thing, and it's not happening in mindsets. It's happening in the physical world. The paradox, the barber lives in a village, and the village has this rule, etc., etc. Okay, so we don't like these paradoxes, especially a paradox in the physical world, because contradictions are not allowed in the physical world. Okay, and the solution is as follows. No such village exists like this. Okay, a village cannot exist with this rule. Okay, that if you cut your own hair, you don't go to the barber. If you don't cut your own hair, you have to go to the barber. It cannot exist. Okay, because that would entail a contradiction. So this story is describing something that cannot exist. Okay, because you cannot have a contradiction in the physical world. Okay, so that's an example of self-referential paradox, and it's a paradox that's resolved by realizing that it cannot exist. So you're not really talking about the physical world. You're talking about something you're making up in your brain, and there's contradictions. But no such village, isolated village, could have that strict rule, because it wouldn't make sense with that particular with the barber. Who cuts the barber's hair?
So next, Barry phrase and Barry's paradox. You could tell us about this.
Right. So Barry's paradox, I don't want to get into it because it's a little bit technical, but basically it's about describing numbers, how big of a number it is. Okay, so and again, they can read it in the thing, but I'd rather talk about the philosophical point of it. The point is as follows: is that a number, when you're describing a number with the English language, you can get into paradoxes. So numbers are exact. 3 + 4 is 7. That's unarguable. You can't argue with that. You can argue if Van Gogh's painting is beautiful or not. You can argue if Bollywood films are good or not, except if Ashwari's in it. Then that's also unarguable. She's perfect. But you can't argue with math. You can argue with Van Gogh's paintings. You can argue about morality. You can argue about politics. Okay, but there are certain properties of numbers that you cannot argue with. Okay, Barry's paradox is an example of I'm sorry. So properties of numbers cannot be argued with. 2 + 3 is 5. There's no argument about it. Okay, but what Barry's paradox is doing is talking about describing a number. Okay, using language to describe a certain number, and there you come up with some real paradoxes, and they're very interesting paradoxes. Okay, but again, to get into the technical details, it just I would lose the listeners, especially if I didn't have a board and to talk it out. But it's a paradox about describing numbers, not about numbers. Nobody argues about the properties of numbers. But they are. I just want to point out you can't argue about the properties of numbers, but there are certain properties of numbers that we don't know the answer. Okay, so let me give you an example. Okay, we all know what a prime number is, right? 2, 3, 5, 7. These are numbers that can't be factored. Okay, and it's about 2,000 years old idea that there's an infinite number of prime numbers. There are always more prime numbers. Okay, now there's something else called twin primes. Okay, let me explain to you what twin primes are. Those are two primes that are separated by two numbers. Like 3 and 5 are two numbers. They're both numbers, 3 and 5. They're separated by 2. Okay, and they're both prime. Okay, 11 and 13 are twin primes. 11 is a prime, 13 is a prime. Let's go on.
29 and 31. Sir, 29 and 31.
29 and 31 is twin primes. So, okay. Okay, so now we can ask the following question. We know that there's an infinite number of primes. Question, is there an infinite number of twin primes? Okay, and the answer is, we have no idea. Nobody knows the answer to that question. So that's an example of something that, no contradictions, but it's a simple statement about numbers, and we simply do not know the answer. We have we use computers to find very large twin primes, but that doesn't mean that there's an infinite number of them. Okay, because our computers are just dealing with, even if a computer's dealing with trillions and trillions of numbers, it doesn't mean that we know we're talking about infinite. Okay, so again, we know that there's an infinite number of primes. We don't know that there's an infinite number of twin primes. Okay, I just want to say, so in the last section, we talk about Berry's paradox, and we talk about Richard's paradox. We talk about, those are two paradoxes about numbers that are beautiful. But the other thing in that section is a discussion about Ramanujan, who was the greatest Indian mathematician of all time. So there's a little story there. When I'm talking about an interesting number, we talk about this story about Ramanujan, and I think it's worth saying it. Ramanujan was the greatest mathematician in the world in his time, and he left India and he came to England, and he studied under Hardy, or he worked under Hardy, who was the greatest mathematician in England at the time. Anyways, Ramanujan was a very sickly person, and he got sick, and Hardy came to visit him in his hospital, and Hardy was a mathematician and Ramanujan was a mathematician, and so they talked about mathematics. So Hardy says to Ramanujan, you know, I came on a taxi to visit you in the hospital, and the taxi number was a very uninteresting number. Okay, and his number was 1729. And Ramanujan, who was best friends with every single number, he said, no, 1729 is not an uninteresting number. And he gave some interesting property about 1729. Again, I can get into the technical details, but it would lose you. It would lose the person who's listening, or it's just not interesting. But the point is, finding this is exactly what you said earlier about the word interesting is not clear. But finding a number that's not interesting is a very hard thing to do, because there's always different properties. So Ramanujan, who knew every number intimately, he was able to find a very interesting property about 1729.
You can explain why it is an interesting number, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, so 1729 is it's a sum. You can add two numbers and you can get 1729. So you can add, let's say, 1,000 plus 729. That's two numbers. But it's the sum. It's the sum of two numbers. Each number is a cubed. In other words, it's raised to the third power. So 1729 is equal to 10 to the third, which is 1,000. 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000. Okay, plus some 9 to the third. 9 times 9 is 81, times 9 is 729. But you can also do it another way. 12 to the third is 1728. 12 times 12 times 12 is 1728. Plus 1 to the third is 1 times 1 times 1 is 1729. So what Ramanujan said is 1729 is the first number that can be added, that is the sum of two cubes in two different ways. Okay, so 1729 is equal to 1 to the third plus 12 to the third. It's also equal to 9 to the third plus 10 to the third. Okay, and that's the first number that can be done. But the amazing thing is that Ramanujan knew this at the moment. You know, the goddess came and told him this immediately. So that's just an interesting. So what we thought was not an interesting number, or what Hardy thought was not an interesting number, Ramanujan found an interesting property for that. Okay. Anyways, the book is full of these interesting little stories, cute little stories. Anyways, any other questions?
So you have covered all of our questions and you have explained the second chapter of the Noson.
Anyways, my friends, it's a pleasure talking to you. It's a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
Any message you want to give to the sir, our younger generation from India and South Asia?
Yes, you should all try to imitate Ramanujan.
Sure, sir, sure.
He did amazing things, and unfortunately, he died very, very young, and that's a very sad thing. But they still study his works. They published his notebooks, and there's still he didn't really prove a lot, but he just knew things, and that's an amazing property. And people argue with whether some of the statements that he made were true or not true. They still don't know, and it's 70, 80, 90 years later, and they still don't know. Well, I think I gave enough. If you want to be a computer scientist, you gotta program a lot of programs. If you want to be a mathematician, you gotta do a lot of problems. If you want to be a scientist, you got to read a lot of books and learn a lot of science. And go to it. Anyways, my friends, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Same here, sir. It's our pleasure also talking to you.
Likewise.
Have a wonderful week, and hopefully we'll continue.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sure,
Okay.
sure, sir, sure.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, sir.